everybody, and welcome to our April episode of the Archaeology of Connecticut. This month, we're going to discuss the topic of disaster archaeology. Natural and cultural disasters like hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, fires, and cultural disasters such as bombings and warfare can dramatically impact the archaeological record. In recent years, natural events influenced by human-driven climate change have wreaked havoc on communities across the country. We've all seen the images of devastated landscapes on the news, and the immediate focus is on the people whose lives have been upended. But as communities recover from disasters, part of the cleanup and mitigation is an assessment of the cultural and historical resources that were lost or damaged. This evening, we're joined by Labadia and Cory Atkinson, two archaeologists with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, to talk about the impacts of disasters on the archaeological record, the types of resources impacted, the response to such situations, how these projects are paid for, and why archaeology is an important part of disaster mitigation. So I think we've had both of you on the show before, but it would be great if you could just reintroduce yourself quickly and tell us a little bit about your work at the State Historic Preservation Office to get started.
Sure. My name is Cory Atkinson. I'm an archaeologist with the State Historic Preservation Office, as Sarah said, and I work in environmental review, which is our regulatory compliance portion of our office. And so I look at impacts of state and federally funded or permitted projects, and look at the impacts to archaeology by those projects.
And I'm Labadia. I am also a staff archaeologist. I do a lot of the same duties as Cory. I'm also the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer. And we also manage a lot of archaeology programs through our office, such as the State Archaeology Preserves, which we've talked about on the show before, and just providing general technical guidance and advice for people.
Great, thank you so much. So let's just jump right into our topic. I think here in Connecticut, as a rule, we don't suffer some of the major national disasters that other parts of the country do, but we do certainly have them, right? And we have had incidents that have caused a lot of damage to the landscape and the archaeological record. So what types of disasters here in Connecticut are the biggest threat to our archaeological resources?
So I think the natural disaster or the event that we are seeing the most are major storm events. And those are a combination of flooding and tornadoes. Something that we saw just this past year, which I think Connecticut had been spared for a long time, is wildfires. So that's something that's new.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, fire archaeology is a whole subset of archaeology, which we can get into if we have time later. So in the last couple of years, we've had a lot of major floods here in Connecticut because of some of our strong storms. What is it about flooding? What does it do to the archaeological record? And why are the floods that we're getting so damaging to archaeological resources? Is it due to the location on the landscape and kind of our use of the resources over time that kind of put archaeological sites in those locations? Why is it that these disasters have been such a threat to our archaeological resources?
So I think there's a lot of different things that are going on. One of the first things is the interaction between the natural and the cultural. So we're occupying spaces on the landscape that typically we haven't. And what's happening is we're changing the way water flows around things. And so it's causing flooding in places that normally hadn't flooded in the past. And so sometimes being able to be proactive in these types of situations is difficult because things are changing so fast. But the flooding in particular is problematic because it can be a very slow process of destroying an archaeological site. And we see that with erosion and scour. And I have to say, we are looking at it from this disaster, this destructive perspective, but flooding can also be a good thing for archaeological sites. I know you've spent a lot of time talking about the Brian Jones site in Avon. If not for regular flooding, and there's plenty of great archaeological sites in Connecticut that have been preserved that way because they've now laid that soil as an overburden and protected the site. But when we're talking about it in a destructive manner, what we're seeing is flooding, and as the waters recede, taking all that soil with them. So now they're being exposed to erosion and scour.
And you're losing that archaeological context, which is the key. And another important thing to note is the increasing nature of catastrophic flooding events, or the increasing frequency of catastrophic flooding events, where we're seeing not just your typical storms where like you typically would have the old standards of 50-year and 100-year floods, those old categories of separating different storm types and levels of storms are kind of going out the window. Those models are no longer relevant because as we're seeing more of these huge flooding events, the more water that is being dumped on a particular area leads to increased chances of erosion and those really devastating processes. And it kind of jumps over those minor flooding events that gradually over time would protect sites such as the Brad Jones site.
So there's a really important thing that we learn about as archaeologists, and that's taphonomy. How does your archaeological site get to be the way your archaeological site is? And I think when you start off as a new archaeologist, you have this vision that the site is pristine, that you're walking into it just like people laid it out there. But the truth is there are post-depositional processes that are happening all the time to sites. What we're seeing now, though, is how devastating some of those natural processes can be. And so we are trying to document some of these things. So in addition to saving the sites, we're just trying to document them so archaeologists in the future will know what these post-depositional things have been. So is this now new artifact concentration that you're finding a result of having been washed down the hill? You're not looking at the site, but kind of the site being removed to another location. And so that we can help us interpret things coming in the future.
And there are certain natural processes in site development and site destruction that are always going to occur. Like I'm thinking of a river context where there might be a meandering river that will change its natural channel or course over time. And while that might be a gradual process that could erode a site, the increased events that we're seeing may speed up natural processes and exacerbate the problems before we have a chance to go in there and record any information documenting those depositional processes that led to the formation of the site as we know it.
And I'm just going to add one other quick thing in, which is, we're talking about all these complicated issues with sites and understanding them. There is probably the most devastating process that exists, which has perfectly sealed sites when we think of Pompeii. Super destructive. And, you want to talk about a place sealed in time, that would be it. So sometimes destruction can be an archaeologist's friend, but it's always the major concern comes down to human life and safety.
I was wondering, there's a movement, it seems to be taking foot across the country about removing old dams and low-head dams and different kind of waterway control systems that aren't being used anymore. Is there any foresight or, is there any planning into how that's going to affect archaeological sites, or are we kind of flying by the seat of our pants right now?
No, there's actually been a lot of studies about that, Scott. And this is one of those things that I was saying about the way people have this relationship between nature and culture and how we have changed the natural flow of movement, either by channelizing it or in the case of the dams, actually holding back the water. So for those projects, one of the things that we do look at, and for Cory and I, most of the dam removals are part of federal funding or require some type of federal permit. So we do see most of them. And there has been a lot of studies done about changing water levels and how that may impact archaeological sites. And so you really have to think about the drying out that generally happens upriver as opposed to all the new water bringing in downriver.
And to that point, there are definitely examples we have right here in New England of when either drawing down an existing reservoir or removing a dam can actually expose preserved remains, like the Pompeii example that Kathy brought up, and where former towns that may have been taken through eminent domain, all the remnants may be still visible under that reservoir environment. So it may actually lead to the exposure of sites that are still technically intact, but were impacted by those changes to the landscape introduced by humans.
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a tangent just from the whole disaster theme, but we're talking about things like those dam removals and things like that, going back to, restore some old water courses to their more historic pathways and things like that. There's an archaeological and cultural resources aspect to some of those, right? Because a lot of the changes that were made to the way that water moved around the landscape happened a couple of centuries ago, right? Where people were damming and changing and channeling and things like that for industry locally. So there's a whole archaeological aspect of documenting, I think, and maybe not necessarily preserving, but at least documenting those types of resources as part of our history as well, because our environmental history is obviously very complicated and influenced by those human activities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, if you think just about the Farmington Canal alone, I'm sure everybody has seen the trail, but that was a major engineering waterworks of diverting water for transportation. And in the wake of that, there was multiple small streams that were now receiving water or losing water in different ways. And it does a couple things. So, not to get too far from the destructive archaeology, but it also, for archaeologists, when we're looking for sites, we always have this, kind of group of core environmental features we're looking at. And so you always have to be mindful that what you may see on the ground today is not the way that ground has always been.
Definitely. So we've talked a little bit about flooding, but what about other types of disasters? What impacts do things like fires and high wind type storms have on the archaeological record, and other examples that you can think of?
Yeah, Cory and I were talking a little bit earlier today, and for the wind events, I mean, what happened a few years ago in Hamden and Sleeping Giant Park, I was saying, when I was starting off in archaeology, the first thing that I would do on pedestrian survey is look for tree throws. Because it was like somebody had already dug a unit for me, and you could go scouring through it. And as you know, while it makes things easier, it also destroys the context that archaeologists are always so concerned about. So at the Sleeping Giant State Forest in Hamden, there was, I forget what the category tornado was that came through, but it uprooted a ton of trees. And it's not even just the event itself. So all those trees that came up that did have, some archaeology with them, those were very pinpointed areas of impact within a site. But the state had to clean those trees up. So now to get to those trees, they need an access road. They need to bring in equipment. They need to pull those trees out. And all of those actions can have potential impacts. So, a lot of what we think of when we respond to disasters from our office, when we're giving technical advice and guidance, is be trying to be proactive, but we understand that when you have to react to the event, how can you do it with the softest possible touch so you're not magnifying what the natural environment has already done?
And I know we might eventually get into what we do about planning for these events, but part of what Kathy is saying and the effects from the response to the event, a lot of the ways in which we can go about mitigating the effects of these events is to put in place plans early on with the responding agencies to try to minimize their footprints, understanding that there would be no time to address archaeological concerns in the middle of a disaster event.
Right. And that's a really important point, right, is that these things are happening and they have all kinds of different ramifications. Some of them are far more severe to human health and safety and things like that than archaeology. So it's always, I guess, going to be a little bit of a balance, trying to strike a balance, right, between the cultural resources and other things that need to happen. I was just thinking of another relatively recent example of wind-related archaeology. Back in 2012 on the New Haven Green,
yes,
when storms uprooted trees and the remains of some of the people who were buried there, right? Mm-hmm. Which was it was on the night before Halloween, and
very appropriate.
Yeah, very appropriate. And that was a case that my predecessor, Nick Bellantoni, got drawn into as state archaeologist to go and do the recovery there and the analysis of the burials from the New Haven Green. But, these events definitely have an impact. What about fire? We haven't had we have had more brush fires in the last year or so, right? And that's the thing that we've been hearing a lot about as a threat that's creeping farther and farther east over time with climate change. What types of impacts do fires have on archaeological resources?
Yeah, so the impacts are still new for Connecticut, but they do have the potential to affect, first of all, creating false archaeological sites, creating spots where you may believe that there's a hearth, and then having that charcoal migrate down into actual hearths and really upsetting our carbon-14 dates and our understanding of certain sites.
Plus, I think depending on how intense the event is, just the heat alone can have an impact on cultural features, depending on how close they are to the surface and what the level of impact would be from the fire. But I think there's a lot to learn about these types of effects, especially in New England. I think in the West, it might be a little more understood what the impacts from a fire would be, since they have teams in place already to handle that sort of thing. But I think up in the Northeast, it's definitely a learning process that we're in now.
Yeah, and part of what we look for are thermally altered materials or heat-treated rocks. And, like I said, I think it's kind of new for Connecticut, but we don't know how those fires may be affecting our interpretations when we find objects, if they do.
Yeah, and I would imagine, too, the burning off of a lot of vegetation could speed up other processes like erosion and things of that nature that could also have detrimental effects.
Mm-hmm. And then there's replanting.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely. So can you, we talked a little bit about the situation at Sleeping Giant with the trees, but can you give us a couple of other examples of some disasters that you've encountered in your careers as archaeologists and how they impacted archaeological and historical resources?
Sure. I got one from Hurricane Sandy was a big event. And at the time, while I was not working for the State Historic Preservation Office, I was working for a consulting firm, and we were on a project in Staten Island, New York, of all places, doing a data recovery operation. And as luck would have it, we had finished the excavations a week or two prior to the Hurricane Sandy hitting, and which would have completely obliterated the site. So a lot of our ability to respond to these sort of events or document the sites prior to destruction can come down to just happenstance and chance and luck, and our ability to document this site that was in amongst this completely urban context, but within a property that just happened to escape development. So that's one that stands out in my mind, because I think when we returned to the site a few weeks later, everything was gone. There was shipping containers that were floated up on water that moved across the road. It was a really destructive event, but we just happened to be in the right place at the right time for that one.
I was with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office when Sandy hit. It's actually kind of when I came on board. And I think the single biggest obstacle that we faced is not knowing what we know. And by that, I mean, we did not have a really good way to inventory and see where the high impact areas are and what we may have anticipated as having been, destroyed or somehow affected. And that actually is what prompted our office to create a geographic information system and acquire the money to do that. And one of the interesting things about the way our system is organized is, in addition to having the pinpoint data for archaeological sites, anybody can see what we call the archaeology grid. And that grid is based on a FEMA response grid. Because in talking to FEMA, they said, listen, there's going to be times where street addresses don't matter because there isn't going to be a street. So what you really need to do is find a coordinate system that everybody understands and knows where it is on the earth. And so we adopted that grid system so that in future events where we may not know where the streets are or have other types of identification landmarks, we can use that information to say, this is an archaeologically sensitive area. And so when you go do search and rescue, employ these procedures. And FEMA has been working on those, with input from our office. The other thing that we did do after Hurricane Sandy, that again, every disaster turns out to be a learning lesson that helps prepare you for the next one. So for Sandy, we did a complete bankline survey of all of Connecticut's state-owned property. So that helped us get a better baseline on the major storm events that might be associated with the hurricane, as well as the long-term effects that may be related to rising sea levels. And so now with that baseline, we can actually monitor how sites are doing, what portions of them we're losing, how to characterize them. And, all of that is happening because there was funding from the government that came through to make it happen. I think without that disaster funding, we wouldn't be in this situation. And, even now we are in the situation of, okay, we know, so we're better off than we were when Sandy came. We know where these are, but we also know that we're slowly losing them. And when we do work with the state on, other activities to try to prevent coastal loss, such as, putting up seawalls or living shorelines, in doing all of those things, we have to choose, which are the sites that we're going to save, which ones are worth the extra investment. And it's not always an easy thing.
And it tends to be another recent example I'm thinking is the Southbury Training School that we went down to and Southford Falls.
Sure.
For the recent storm event. When was that? In August last year?
Mm-hmm.
That was a big one too, because that just shows the importance of having funding and a partner willing to do something, where in this case it's a state-owned property. So in the case, I think it gets difficult when you get into these cases where it's a privately owned site, and and it's up to the landowner to be the one stewarding the site or protecting it from further harm or preventing the erosion.
Do you want to talk about what we saw down at
Absolutely.
Southbury? Yeah, go ahead.
So on Southford Falls, after that storm event, we were called to respond to Southford Falls State Park, because the state park is actually home to the former home to the Diamond Match Factory. And the Diamond Match Factory is located right along the river there. And as a result of the flooding event, a high volume of water was forced through these small seasonal brooks, and eventually through the drainage network made its way to the river along Southford
Because
Falls.
it overtopped a dam.
Because it overtopped the dam, yeah. And overtopped culverts. We witnessed at the Southbury Training School nearby, we had seen, for example, culverts that were 10 plus feet high, where the water had completely gone over the top of the parapet. So it was a pretty devastating event. But as a result of this flooding at Southford Falls State Park, the Diamond Match Company's ruins were exposed. And when we arrived to observe the damage, there was actually people picking through the ruins, and which is to say that the event led to a looting of an archaeological site. Mm-hmm. And while a lot of those materials that had been washed out lost their context as the result of the disaster, there was still some portion of the ruins that were intact that we were worried about further loss of context.
Yeah, it was an amazing thing to see, because the factory itself had been completely filled in and covered with sediment and green grass. And I think any other day, if you visited this park, you would have no idea what was beneath your feet. And when the water came over, it stripped all of that topsoil off and just exposed, hundreds of feet of continuous ruins.
At a depth of 5 to 10 feet deep of scour.
Yeah, it was amazing.
I think that you bring up a really interesting point on that, right? It's hard to get people to not want to pick something up that they see. And then you add in the situation where, there's been this disaster, even though that was I would say kind of a localized disaster. Yeah. And it was still hard to get them to leave those things behind, because they do still have some archaeological context that might be useful for research. And should we get an archaeologist out there and be able to collect them?
Agreed. And it also raised even further health and safety concerns, because it led to a potential further destruction of the site in an effort to repair the damage, because representatives of the park really wanted to take care of this scour, because they were concerned about potential injuries or what have you. But at the same time, the site itself became a lure to that exact point of danger that they were trying to get people to avoid. So that in turn caused a rush to take care of the damage, maybe at the peril of the archaeological context. So luckily they were able to called us in for technical advice, and we were able to find a path forward to mitigate the effects of the storm and to rebury the site to preserve what was left and cap off those deposits, while also allowing for the site to, or for the park to open up and allow hikers through again with no danger.
Right. So it's really important to try and strike that balance, right, between the needs of all the different parties or stakeholders that might be involved in a situation like this. Can you just talk a little bit about what you did when you got out there, you know, what the response was like, what you did when you got out there, how you surveyed and assessed the damage and came up with, you know, a plan for moving forward?
Yeah, I think the plan for moving forward is always dependent upon what the needs of the project are. So, you know, even though—
And the resource that's
and the resource that's there. So even though we're having this very general discussion, I'll be honest with you, you know, what I'm saying about Southford Falls may not be applicable to the next situation. But what we saw there, what the need was for the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection was to get the site back open and to access a water crossing. So there was a bridge that had been completely pushed off of its abutments, and it was important for them to be able to straighten that bridge. The only way they could do it is if they brought in heavy equipment. The only way they could get the heavy equipment there was by driving over the site.
And the abutments that the bridge, just as a side note, the abutments that the bridge was sitting on were in fact part of the original historic complex, and the bridge itself had some significance with it for its ties to Eric Sloan.
Yeah. So there was, you know, so we wanted to help DEEP achieve their goals. And, you know, it's just a combination of using best practices within archaeology and thinking about what makes sense. So we had requested that they bring in clean fill and filter cloth so that if in the future we needed to pull everything back again, we could, but that there would be separation between the new topsoil and everything that's being brought in. And with the type of fill we are using, it creates sort of a buffer so things were not getting crushed.
And I think a really important aspect of that project in coming to this compromise and solution was the formation and development of relationships between agencies, because that's really what allows archaeology to be considered when these events come up, because they're usually time sensitive, and a lot of what we hear in the State Historic Preservation Office depends largely on the relationships we've built outside of our agency.
Thank you. What about Sandy? Can you just talk? I mean, that was it was just such an epic storm event. I mean, we call it Superstorm Sandy, right, for a reason. Can you talk about some of the things that, some of the impacts that Sandy had to the archaeological record and what parts of the state were impacted by that?
Yeah, so the biggest impacts were probably within the city of Milford, which is a shoreline town, which has a large number of previously recorded archaeological sites. And it's kind of the common theme that we've been talking about over and over again. It's exposure of sites that had been previously covered with soil that has now been ripped away, mostly from not the water coming in, but the water moving back and receding and exposing these places. So mostly what we were getting is reports from actually concerned citizens saying, you know, hey, we're cleaning up in this area and we found these arrowheads, we found these pieces of pottery, we found these items. And so that it became part of the documentation effort. But again, it's this whole idea of what are you seeing? Is it something that has already been displaced from a site and has been now carried to this location? Or are you seeing that peeling back of a site that's beneath it? So there's a lot of site visits that happened, a lot of talking with people, but it is helping us build up that database so we can respond in the future. The one area that I think Sandy must have had a big impact, but one which is probably even more difficult for us to wrap our heads around is submerged resources. And I would say in the state of Connecticut, this is probably not our strongest, strong suit within archaeology is the underwater archaeology. But we have friendships with a few divers who did let us know that some of the wrecks they were used to dealing with after Hurricane Sandy had moved or been toppled or who had lost major parts of them. So again, it's an area we don't have a big handle on. It's, probably under evaluated resource, and certainly something that we would, like to get a better idea of what we're dealing with.
You bring up that the public played a role in reporting this.
Yeah.
Is what should someone who sees a disaster and then feels there's an archaeological site, how should they address that, and how can they get in touch with you to report that?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that question, because when these disasters happen, there is way more important information that's coming to the public than worrying about the archaeological sites. So I will put that out there. This is my life's goal, but certainly in a time of disaster, don't worry about us first.
We're worried about people first, and then we move through the priorities, right?
Okay, so then after you get people and safety, next one, archaeology for sure. In which case, Connecticut, we're lucky because we have both the State Historic Preservation Office and we also have the Office of State Archaeology. And so what would be important, or what I would like people to do, is one, don't take it upon yourself to continue digging. That if you see something, it works for everything. See something, say something. It would be great if you can reach out to either of our offices, either through email or telephone or whatever way is available. Photo document it, because stability is probably the biggest thing. You don't know what might be lost as part of the cleanup. You don't know if things will be lost as the storm patterns are changing. So when you see it, the photo documentation is extremely important. We do have forms on our website that are for recording either pre-contact or historic period archaeological sites. Sometimes we might ask you to do those, but just doing an initial reach out is a big help. And the pictures, even if you can't identify what all the artifacts are, the reason why that's helpful is because it will help us know, is this a situation where we really do want somebody to go out there immediately? And there are, certain indicators, I think, for both Sarah and I and Cory, one of the most important things that we're worried about is with human burials being exposed. And there are certain patterns of artifacts, certain types of things we would see that might indicate that that's happening, in which case we would want to get out there sooner rather than later.
So you touched briefly a little bit earlier when we were talking about it to some of the things that we do to protect people and property from these storms and from these events, right? And those could include things like coastal hardening, erosion control, seawalls, riprap, those kinds of things. So I guess I have a couple questions surrounding that. One, if we step back and think about the places where people have traditionally had the most intensive settlement, right, on our landscape, those are often near water, near our rivers and coastal areas, right? So the same areas that are oftentimes most threatened by these types of events. Mm-hmm. So what types of impacts do these things that we do to protect people and property potentially have on archaeological sites? And how do we deal with that? How do we deal with kind of that balance in those types of projects, like identifying the archaeological resources or historic resources, and then trying to come to a compromise where we can document them or mitigate them and still do the work that needs to be done to protect people?
Mm-hmm. Well, the good part about those types of projects is a lot of them will require a federal or state oversight, and which means they would come to our office for review, in which case when they're located in areas that are particularly archaeologically sensitive, and again, being along the coast or rivers tend to be archaeologically sensitive, and unless there's reason that sensitivity no longer exists. But the good news there is that's the main way we are able to evaluate sites through our office, is by recommending them certain projects that may have these impacts for a survey. And as I just said, those that are located on the coast tend to require those types of permits that would require our review.
Yeah, and certain types of interventions are less impactful than others. So I love the living shorelines. Those are great. low impact, high value. Generally, for those types of projects, I say you're doing a benefit to archaeology. You're preserving that landform, and like I said, in a very low impact way. Riprap, kind of very similar thing, that kind of stone armoring. Very rarely do they have to do any digging, grading, footings. I mean, occasionally they do, but usually it is just the placement of stone, which to me, again, stabilizes that landform in case of a storm event. Where it starts to get trickier is when you're dealing with the seawalls. Or, for example, right now in Bridgeport, there's a very large project going on called Resilient Bridgeport, where there are large seawalls and floodgates and other things. It is
drainage.
Yeah, it is a major project, and that was a balancing act. So, what is really being saved there is where the highest human population is. But what is going to be sacrificed to the storm is all of Seaside Park. And that was, something that had to be decided of where these things go. Now, fortunately, we were able to do some archaeological surveys before that project and to identify areas where, for at least the archaeological record, it will have a minimal impact. But there was the space there where we could balance those things. In some cities, it's not always as easy to do. And in some cities too, I'll just add, like New London stands out to me as well, because New London is thinking of a similar type of thing. In 1938, after we had the big hurricane, all of the boats that were pretty much along that whole stretch of the river were actually scuttled and pushed up to the shoreline within New London. And so it has all these, what we now would think of as great archaeological remains that are part of a previous storm event.
Yeah, it's so challenging too, because you bring up the example of Bridgeport, when of course the park itself is an historic resource, right, with a lot of history, and but we do have to make these trade-offs, I think, in ways, and try to find the best balance. So we talked a little bit about the public, having people come forward and, let you know if they see things that have been damaged during a storm event. But how might we integrate the public more fully into the process of disaster archaeology? When we were going back and forth with notes, you mentioned sort of like citizen scientists. There's lots of people who are interested locally in their communities and volunteering. How might you kind of see that working, where people could get involved in kind of disaster archaeology kind of mitigation or salvage? I mean, I know it's always, one challenge is always having the time or the other people to manage them, the trained archaeologists. But do you see a role for the regular citizen in this type of work in the future potentially?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think the first step we needed to take was to create a digital system at our office to move away from paper, because paper doesn't work well in a disaster situation. FEMA has also done a great job with their data collectors and how they collect data. So I think, using that kind of a model and being able to create phone apps or, other digital type of apps where people could immediately send data to a location or information would be very helpful. The thing is what has to be evaluated immediately is how safe it is for archaeologists to even go there. Mm-hmm. So really for us, a lot of the heavy lift, the excavating if needed or recording, can happen as long as we know that the landform is stable and it is safe for us to go there. So some of the, cleanup or post event processing doesn't need to happen immediately. It can wait. But I think what is always important to have immediately is the reports of where things are, so that then we can plan those post-event recoveries.
And even pre-event, having public involvement and just advocating for resources to deal with these issues before they become a problem in a disaster event, or especially for areas that may fall through the cracks because they don't fit within the regulatory parameters. Finding ways to create programs to maybe assess which sites are at the most risk, and trying to advocate for resources to deal with those sites.
Yeah, it makes me think, Sarah, that maybe we have a good program on our hands, which is, students are always looking for sites to excavate. Let's focus on those ones that are in these hazard areas that are really threatened, not by cultural, but from natural disasters. And maybe we should create a hit list so when universities are working with their students, they can make some recommendations.
Yeah, and potentially, direct field school programs and things like that to those sites as well, so we could integrate more people into the data collection, because sometimes the workload, it certainly surpasses our capabilities between our offices.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just having excavations of those types of sites may provide you interesting results that you may not be expecting, like evidence of previous erosive processes and what might have been lost.
Yeah, I mean, there's things that archaeologists know about the changes of settlement patterns over time and how it responds to environmental change.
Yeah, and I think that, I'd like to talk about funding a little bit at the end, but maybe before we do that, we could talk a little bit more, just because it's really interesting. I think you brought up taphonomy, right? And the idea that our disasters and like these natural events can sometimes create archaeological sites and deposits, and then we have to be able to recognize them when we're doing archaeology in the field, right? Let's talk a little bit more about that. I was thinking, you brought up the Brian Jones site in Avon. So for those of you who haven't heard of the site or aren't familiar with our discussions on it in the past, this is the oldest archaeological site in Connecticut. It's located on the Farmington River in Avon. And it was incredibly deeply buried deposits dating back to around 12,700 years ago. And what we learned about that site through the archaeological and geophysical work that was conducted there, and geological, was that particular place on the landscape had kind of a unique geology that kind of constrained the Farmington River in such a way that even in time periods where there was a lot of high energy flooding, right, that part of the river was never able to kind of get those water speeds up. So when flooding happened there, it was very gentle, and it just kind of like gently washed over the area, and then it would deposit silt, building and building and building up over this site, which protected it over time. Although I was thinking about this when we were talking earlier about when we were actually out there in the field in 2019, how once we had started the excavations and we were working with the construction crew at the time, right? So they had done a lot of clearing of the area. They had started to build an access road. And then we had this huge storm, and the water just rushed down that cleared access road and just covered the site with mud.
Yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah, I did too until we were just talking about it. So it was sort of like a real-time kind of archaeological impact, like while we were in the field.
And I like to compare that to the Templeton site where, right, the river and the stream are not constrained, and you'll dig a unit and you'll come onto this big cobbly kind of layer that's, storm deposited by, through a stream by some high energy kind of event, and dig another unit a meter away, and that's not there. So a difference in how those, that taphonomy, how that site's being created, and how those natural, they probably weren't disasters then, but how those natural water courses are changing what we see in the ground. And it took me a while to understand that, I think.
I think what it really points out is, when you're an archaeologist, I think with a lot of disciplines, you need to know something about something else. And in this case, it's geology.
Yes, it helps.
Yeah, definitely. We talk about the Hollister site a lot on this project, and that's right on the river. And there's a lot of history of very damaging floods along the Connecticut River, right, in the colonial period all the way up through the present day. But one thing that we've encountered at this site, and it's really the most dramatic modern disturbance to this 17th century landscape, are these big cement-filled tobacco barn posts from a 20th century tobacco barn. And all you find are the posts, but what we know from local oral history is that there was a tobacco shed on that site in the 1920s and 30s, and then one day there just wasn't. They woke up in the morning and it had just been washed away down the river, the whole barn. And we find, the remains of that on just about every year we hit one during the course of our excavation.
So can I ask? So we have. Cory touched on this earlier in the program, but we have a lot of shows on ICRV Radio that kind of underscore the quickness, the ramped up pace that things are being eroded, things are changing. Ranger Russ down at Meggs Point Nature Center said that he's been at Meggs Point for over 22, 23 years, that the landscape has changed drastically since his tenure there, that things that would take 100 years naturally to happen are happening in 5 years. Mm-hmm. So I respect you guys on so many different levels. One thing that you have that I'll never have beyond the intellect is patience. I mean, you guys sit there and one grain of sand at a time. You can do this, but when we're talking about 100-year change happening in 5 years, it puts on a sense of urgency. Now, you guys are a lot of things, but one of the things that you are, one of the things that you are teachers. So in the spirit of wanting to teach and wanting to preserve, does this all just put on a sense of urgency for you? And if so, how do you deal with that?
That's a hard question.
It's a hard question, and it's a cycle. So, like I said, when I started at the SHPO's office, it was during Hurricane Sandy. And, our partners at the National Park Service came down because they were administering some funding. And I remember, just being very passionate. And they said, you can't save everything. You need to make decisions. And I just thought, oh, that's such a pessimistic view. No way. And, yeah, maybe I was naive, but you can't. I'm at that point now where I recognize that you can't. And when you talk about the urgency, I think the part that bothers me the absolute most is when you think you are doing your best efforts at preservation and something blows it out of the water. So you say, let's do the living shoreline, let's put in the riprap, let's do all these things to save this important site. And then the 500-year event comes and you only plan for the 100-year event. And my God, how could both of those happen within 5 years of each other? That's the stuff that gets incredibly frustrating. And one of the things that stands out to me is when Cory and I were in Southbury, one of the engineers said to us, we can't change bridge design fast enough. Where we used to design
the flow models
flow models change every single year, and they just can't even design them fast enough for the changes.
I think he said when he started in the 70s, they had one standard that had been in place for 20 years, and now in the last 5 years, there's been 3.
And I think as people, we want, we think things are forever, right? Every burial's forever, every site's forever, everything's forever, every mountain's forever. And if you wait long enough, those things change dramatically. So it is, I think maybe with age, it's kind of helping me understand what you're saying is that, we can go out, we can save the ones we can protect those that we can, but like you said, every one of them isn't possible to protect. And if we did that with every archaeological site, we'd all be living in the yard because we couldn't build roads or highways or all those other things.
Mm-hmm. So I think, David, to your question, one of the important things about archaeology, and listen, I'm from the preservation office. I want to keep archaeological sites intact and in place. The thing that archaeologists are trained to do, though, is remove that information from the ground. And its value is in what it can tell us about who we are and where we've been and about that society and community. And so when we go about excavating these sites, the important thing that we're doing is we're preserving that knowledge.
Right, because when it's done properly, anyone 100 years from now should be able to go back, look at it, and see what we saw through our paperwork and our documentation and our testing process.
So we're not leaving them in place, we're saving them within the museum.
Sarah, does the urgency segue nicely into the funding aspect of the need?
Well, I think it does. And I mean, I think, you've talked a lot about FEMA and the Park Service and different partners that you've had in the federal government. But I mean, a lot of this funding for this type of work and for all the work surrounding, disaster mitigation, not just archaeological and cultural, obviously, comes from state and federal government. And how do you make the case when you have these dramatic situations that are impacting people's lives to keep that funding as part of it, right? Like that it's important to also set aside money and resources to do this type of work when you're fixing roads, fixing bridges, helping to potentially rehouse people and do all the other things that are required. And the second part of my question is, and I hate to phrase it this way, but what challenges do you see in the future as these disasters ramp up, but we seem to be heading more and more towards a position of, for lack of a better term, let's say austerity?
Yeah,
there's a lot to unpack. I mean,
I know,
so
sorry.
one of the good things in terms of the funding is that when there is a disaster, there's always a presidential declaration of the disaster, and part of that has to include, through law, through the National Historic Preservation Act, a consideration of its impact on cultural resources. So there is automatically funding set aside because of that. Now, how that could potentially be challenged or sidestepped in the future, there is always that potential. So advocacy on that particular item is key, that it is important. And there are times when you still have to argue and make the case for it. And the hardest thing is to get the funding for the reaction is easier than the funding for the preparation. I wish that there was more funding for us to save things up front, to be proactive and understand, than always having to rely upon the back end of the disaster to happen and then say, okay, we're going to clean it up now.
And to that point, when we do see preparation, a lot of times it's just building a plan for the reaction. I've noticed. I'm thinking of a program, for example, and we've been talking a lot about flooding, natural disasters, but I'm also thinking about man-made disasters, because I'm thinking about a particular planning set of planning meetings that we were attending as an office for the EPA, and they were trying to find ways to plan for man-made disasters, thinking of the train derailments and the chemical spills, and a lot of those tracks are located right next to rivers. So up front, there wasn't a lot of funding for the investigation of cultural resources that may be impacted, but it was a plan for what to do in reaction to those events down the road that they felt were inevitable. And I think the same goes with natural disasters, and a lot of the planning exercises we've seen so far are towards that end. We're still working in that reactionary environment, but even in a pre-planning type of scenario.
Yeah, well, having served as an emergency planner for one of the municipalities in Connecticut for a while, I think that's the case even with the emergency planning piece, right? It's easier to get the reactionary money than the how do we not put ourselves in this situation. So it looks like that's following right through all the way down to the cultural resource side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, Sarah, to your point, when funds are limited, and so it's always being able to carve out why what you do is important. Mm-hmm. You have to be ready with those talking points. And I will say that archaeology is at a disadvantage even within our office. Those architectural folks in our office, when you can see buildings that are being impacted, it's easier to make the argument. It's always really hard when it's something that people can't see. And so that is why it is so important to have radio shows like this, to have the amount of public outreach that you do, because you rely upon the public to see that value because they've experienced it. That's when you care about things, is when you have that experience, so that they're there and ready when you need to fight for things.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because we see over and over and over again that the best way, to work to preserve our cultural resources is when it comes from people in communities who care about them, right? When they can get the ear of public officials and they can make impassioned cases, for their own communities and things like that. It's a very powerful kind of testimony, I guess, towards the importance of these resources.
Absolutely. Did we answer all your questions, or did we skip over one? Okay.
I think we hit most everything. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on? We have about 2 minutes.
Just that, again, I think there's a lot more that we can do in terms of getting a better handle on things so that we are prepared for the next disaster. But at the same time, I think the most important thing is to remain flexible, because we don't know what that next disaster is going to look like or where it's going to be. And I think that just speaks to the constant changing world that we're living in now.
And to be creative in solutions and how to deal with the impacted resources, because you may have to throw out some of, not ethical considerations is not the right word. It's more your personal convictions and what's important. So while I want to save every part of an archaeological site, for example, that may not be feasible. And so it's just finding that compromise and striking that balance where you're able to preserve as much of the information as possible, but while meeting the needs of people in a time of crisis.
Well, thank you very much for a great conversation. Before we go, can you just share with everybody how they can get in touch with your office if they do have something that they need to report?
I think the best way is if you go to our website. So it's, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but if you just Google
ct.gov/historic-preservation.
There you go. Got it.
Thank you. And as always, you can follow the Office of State Archaeology at osa.uconn.edu and on our social media pages at Facebook and Instagram.
Sure, and FOSA's on, we are on Facebook, follow us there, or fosa-ct.org on the web. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.